The title of our lesson today, as we're looking at Paul in the book of Acts, is when he first became a preacher after he had been converted to Christ, when he began preaching Christ. However, we shouldn't suppose that there is a great deal of time that elapsed between his coming to know Christ, when Christ appeared to him on the road to Damascus, and his preaching. In fact, if we had only the book of Acts to guide us, we would think that after his conversion that Paul almost immediately went back to Jerusalem. It's only from his letters, Galatians and in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, two places in his letters, that he talks about his conversion and about some of the things that happened that surrounded his conversion to Christ. What it does say in the book of Acts is that when Jesus appeared to him, he went into Damascus, and for 3 days and 3 nights he waited for a gospel preacher, Ananias, to come to him and bring him the message of Jesus Christ. During that 3 days and 3 nights, I suppose that Paul wrestled with himself, that he tried to come to some understanding of what had happened. He had his mind, apparently he was convinced that Jesus was an impostor, that he was causing problems for Judaism, and that the only chance that the Jews had to survive was to try to stamp out the Christian religion and its influence over Judaism. And so for 3 days and 3 nights he waited for Ananias to come. Ananias came. There are 3 times in Acts that his conversion is related. Luke tells about his conversion in the 3rd person in Acts the 9th chapter, and then in Acts 22 Jesus talks on the castle steps. The King James Version says castle, and so I've learned it as the castle steps. It was actually there was a big Roman fortification on the north corner of the temple area. And so Paul was apparently being led up into that fortification area out of the temple area proper whenever he asked for permission to speak. And the centurion, remember the tribune that heard him, was surprised that when he spoke to him, and Paul spoke to him in the Greek language. He spoke Greek fluently, and so he asked if he could speak, and he spoke to the crowd then and told about his conversion in Acts 22. And then in Acts 26 he also tells of his conversion, but this time before Agrippa, one of the who is a great-grandson of Herod the Great that had killed the infants in Jerusalem. And so there were several years that passed between Paul's being converted to Christ, his coming to know of Christ, of the preaching of Ananias, and his beginning to preach when the first missionary journey began. Now, the first missionary journey begins in chapter 13 of the book of Acts. But before that time, Paul had spent, after his conversion, he spent 3 years in the city of Damascus, in and about the city of Damascus. It says that he preached in the synagogues that were there. And then from Galatians, we know that he went over into Arabia. How long he spent in Arabia is not clear. I would suppose that he was in Arabia long enough to draw some attention to himself. That is, the Jews that were zealots heard Paul preaching about Jesus the Christ, that they supposed that he was persecuting. And so Paul, and then there is in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, when it says that Aretas, who was the king of Arabia at the time, that he tried to stop Paul from escaping from the city of Damascus, and they let Paul down with a basket over the wall. Now, that is also related in Acts chapter 9, that he was let down in that way, but you wouldn't know that 3 years had passed in between. Well, Paul went back to Jerusalem after three years after his conversion. The book of Galatians is not very clear. It doesn't say whether it was 3 years after Jesus appeared to him, at the end of that 3-year period of time, or if we should start counting the 3 years from the time that he left Jerusalem to go to Damascus. So it's not completely clear the whole time. It would have taken him several days to travel from Jerusalem to Damascus. It's better than 100 miles, and over some rough terrain. The roads aren't too good, and so Paul would have taken some time to travel there and to travel back. When he got back to Jerusalem, he tried to join himself to the church. The church was, of course, strong. There were many Christians, comparatively speaking, in the city of Jerusalem. And Paul tried to join himself to them, but they were afraid of him. And you can understand why they were afraid. He had led many of them to be tried before the Sanhedrin. He lifted his voice against them. He says that he gave his vote against them. And there are some that have supposed from that Paul may have been a member of the Sanhedrin. Now, that causes some problems, and it's not completely clear whether he was or not. I wouldn't say that he was, because a member of the Sanhedrin had to be married. But it is possible, and some have argued, that Paul was married at the time. And so he tried to join himself to the group, to the Christians in Jerusalem. And they were afraid of him. They were afraid that he was just pretending to be one on their side, and that he was planning on bringing many of them bound, captive, maybe to their death, at least to being tortured, in the city of Jerusalem. But finally, Barnabas came across him, and Barnabas was convinced that he was sincere. And it was through Barnabas that he came to be introduced to the church at Jerusalem, and where they accepted him. But in the 9th chapter of Acts, it says that while he was praying in the temple, that the Lord appeared to him and told him that he needed to get out of Jerusalem. And that was the belief of the Brotherhood, too, that if Paul wanted to live, he was going to have to get out of Jerusalem. And so they took him over to the city of Samaria, which was a seacoast town, built by Herod the Great. It was a great Roman metropolis. And so Paul was taken over there. A ship was found that was going north up toward Tarsus. And Paul was sent back, apparently, to his family, maybe to his father and mother. Who knows exactly how old they were at the time. But he was sent back to Tarsus, where he had a family. And he spent several years in Tarsus, somewhere between 8 and 15 years. We don't really know just how long. But nothing further is heard about Paul for several years. Now, there are reasons to say that. In Galatians, when Paul is talking about his conversion, immediately when he went back to Jerusalem, he met with some of the brethren, with Peter, and with James, he says, the Lord's brother. That's the only reference to James as brother of the Lord in the Bible. But he met with James there in Galatians 1, and he met with Peter. He was with Peter a short time. And then he was sent out of Jerusalem back up to his home city. While he is in Damascus, the Bible tells about some other events that took place. We have studied already about Peter in the book of Acts, and how he went through a preaching tour in the area of Judea, trying to strengthen and build up the church. It ended with his coming to Joppa, and of Cornelius sending to him, and Peter then went and preached the gospel to Cornelius. Cornelius apparently was already a believer, but not in Jesus Christ. He believed in the God of the people of Israel, but he needed a lot of teaching. And so Peter taught him more perfectly. Chapter 11 tells about Peter's coming back to Jerusalem and meeting with the church there. And then it tells about the growth of the Gentile church in the city of Antioch. Now this is Antioch of Syria. It's one of the great cities of the empire. And so Barnabas is sent by the Jerusalem church up to Antioch. Among other things, he is going to try to build up the church. And Barnabas remembers that Paul was sent back to Tarsus. It's not far. If you look on a map, you can see that it's not far from Antioch to travel out to the coast and then to take a ship up the river a ways to the city of Tarsus. And Barnabas found Paul and brought him back. And so for 1 year, it says that in the book of Acts, for 1 whole year, Paul preached and taught with Barnabas in the city of Antioch. The church was built up. I believe that the Bible gives ample evidence that the church really grew at Antioch during this period of time, and that Gentile Christianity really developed from Antioch. At the end of a year, there was a preacher who came down, a prophet, the Bible calls him, from the city of Jerusalem, came down from Jerusalem to Damascus. And he prophesied, his name was Agabus, and Agabus prophesied that a great famine was coming on the world, and there was a great deal of poverty in Jerusalem. And so the church in Antioch of Syria determined that they would send some money to try to help the church in Jerusalem. And so this is Paul's first trip back to Jerusalem after some years have passed. But you see, Paul says that it was that 14, in Galatians chapter 2, verse 1, 14 years later. Now, he doesn't say exactly where he starts measuring the 14 years from. Is it from his conversion? I mean, the 3 years to 14 years is a little confusing. But it was long enough for him to learn something about the church, to stay in Jerusalem for a short period of time, and then to leave. And so you see, it is long enough so that he has to spend several years in the area of Tarsus. I don't know what Paul was doing. Critics of the Bible just generally give up on that period of Paul's life. There isn't anything that the Bible says. There aren't any records. So we don't really know what Paul was doing. But knowing Paul as we do, knowing that he began preaching immediately after his conversion, that he went over into Arabia to preach, it's hard to believe that Paul would have spent 13 years in the city of Tarsus without branching out into some of the area round about and preaching in the synagogues the message of Jesus Christ. Well, he stayed in Antioch for a year, and he taught and preached with Barnabas. But the message that Agabus, the prophet, had brought about a famine coming caused Barnabas and Paul to go to Jerusalem and to take some famine relief funds. Now that's right at the end of chapter 11 in the book of Acts. And at the end of chapter 12 it says that Paul went back to Jerusalem. But we don't know much about what Paul was doing in the church at Antioch during this period of time. But chapter 12 is a great chapter. It's about James, the brother of John, is killed, and Peter's arrested and delivered from prison, and the church then at Jerusalem finally comes to be at rest, and they send Paul and Barnabas along with Silas and another preacher by the name of Justus, sends them all back to Antioch so that the church, the Gentile church there, would know what the Jewish Christians what they expected of Gentile converts when they came to Christ. And so we are up to chapter 13 in the book of Acts, and it is there that the missionary journeys begin. At first it says Barnabas and Saul went here, they went there. They were separated by the church from the rest of the church so that they could go on this missionary journey. They went down to the seacoast. It wasn't too far, 30, 40 miles. And they took a ship across to the island of Cyprus. Now, if you know where Cyprus is on the map, you have a good idea where Paul was staying, because it was just north of Cyprus in the Roman province of Cilicia. I always remember Cilicia because there was a short time when Cicero, the great orator, was governor, was assigned to be governor in the province of Cilicia. But Paul and Barnabas traveled across the island, the long way across the island of Cyprus. When they came to the other end, to a city by the name of Paphos, they met the man who was the Roman procurator, not procurator, but proconsul, over that province, over the province of Syria and of Cilicia, the province of Cilicia and the island of Cyprus combined. And so Paul, this is one of the two men in the New Testament who are called proconsuls. A proconsul was a very important office. A procurator was not a very important office. And so Paul preached there to the proconsul on the island of Cyprus. And he met there, do you remember Bar-Jesus, the false prophet? There were a lot of Jews that sort of crop up in the book of Acts who practiced magic and such. The law of Moses had strictly forbidden it. But Bar-Jesus was one of these magic workers who had a lot of influence with the proconsul. And so Paul and Barnabas teach the proconsul. It isn't altogether clear whether the proconsul is converted to Christ or not, but at least the words could be interpreted in that way. There's another thing that's happened sort of interesting there. The proconsul's name was Sergius Paulus. It was spelled with two L's, Paulus. It says there, when Paul and Barnabas are in company with the proconsul, it says Paul, who is also called, or Saul, who is also called Paul, then left the island of Cyprus. From then on, it is Paul and his company. Paul clearly takes the lead at that point. Well, they travel up into Turkey, and then they travel overland. It's a long trip, uphill most of the way. They travel overland to another Antioch, to Antioch of Pisidia. Now, in my opinion, the translation Antioch of Pisidia is not the way it should be translated. It should be Antioch near Pisidia. I think that this Antioch was actually located in the Roman province of Galatia. But they preached there for some time. It's actually that we're studying today in our lesson. Paul's first sermon that is recorded is while he is at the synagogue in Antioch near Pisidia. Pisidia was an area of the Roman Empire, not actually the name of a province. There was certainly no proconsul that was appointed to Pisidia. Pisidia was just a small region of the province of Asia. And so Paul and Barnabas preached there. Paul's first preaching that we have in the book of Acts is in the 13th chapter, when he is at Antioch, which is near the area that the natives called Pisidia. And after that, they go on to another city called Iconium, and then Derbe and Lystra. But I'm convinced that the letter that Paul wrote to the Galatian churches, that he wrote to the Galatian churches, were Antioch near Pisidia, Iconium, Derbe, and Lystra. And so Paul and Barnabas went through those churches, through the synagogues that were there, if they had a synagogue, and they established churches in those cities. And then they came back through the cities. It says that they appointed elders in the churches that were there, and then they went back to Antioch of Syria. If you can, to keep in mind, Antioch of Pisidia is altogether a different place. It isn't near the city in size and population and fame in the Roman Empire that Antioch of Syria was, where the Gentile church first began to make itself felt in the Roman world. But it is when they get back to Antioch in Syria, they encounter a situation where Jewish teachers and preachers have come up from Jerusalem and tried to convince Gentile Christians that they needed to be circumcised to accept the law of Moses if they were going to be saved. And so Paul and Barnabas and some others went up for what we call the Jerusalem Council. But the first preaching that we have of the Apostle Paul directly of his sermon, and I suppose it's abbreviated. Paul may well have preached longer than the book of Acts indicates. But so we probably have an abbreviated portion of Paul's preaching in Acts, the 13th chapter. What he does mainly is to retrace the people of Israel and their history up until the time that Jesus came. And then, of course, when he comes to Jesus, he slows down and preaches a sermon for them to know who Jesus was, how that God had fulfilled his promises and sent Christ to the earth, sent the Christ. So that's what chapter 13 is about. It's Paul's first preaching that we know of in the book of Acts. Well, I hope I haven't covered so much material that I've just lost everybody, but I've enjoyed being with you, and I hope that as many as possible, at least, we can be together in the worship at the Oak Congregation tomorrow. Thank you.